Welcome back to the Ascent podcast episode where we uncover how healthcare leaders use innovation, human or AI, to elevate patient care and practice performance. My guest today is Dr. Alan Goldhammer, founder of True North Health Center in California. His work has helped thousands of patients transform their health through medically supervised fasting and evidence based lifestyle medicine. Dr. Goldhammer, honor to have you here.
Pleased to be here.
Let's start with the foundation of your work. What inspired you to bring fasting into a clinical model?
Yeah, I actually got interested when I was just a kid. I read a book by a guy named Herbert Shelton that said that health had causes, just like disease had causes. And that if you wanted to be healthy, you had to do the things that caused health. And he talked about diet and sleep and exercise. And he also introduced this idea of fasting to undo the consequences of dietary excess. He explained that, people ate too much and they got fat, and part of that fat was visceral fat, and that visceral fat acted like a tumor. It was hypertrophic, hypermetabolic. It gave off inflammatory products that resulted in certain predictable diseases, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, autoimmune disease, and certain forms of cancer like lymphoma. And so the idea that you used fasting to undo the fat that contained the visceral fat that had the inflammation, to undo this wide variety of conditions, to me was very interesting, because those conditions are treated as if they're unrelated. You have to go to a different type of doctor to even be diagnosed with them, let alone treated. And yet his model was that you could reverse all of these diseases by getting rid of the causes of them, which was the inflammation that came from the visceral fat. So I got interested in it very, very young. And, I'm far enough out on the spectrum that, once I got interested in something, that became kind of obsessive. And so I've spent I'm almost 67 years old. So I've spent the last 50 years really looking into this idea of how to help people recover their health and maintain health with fasting and with a whole plant food diet.
It's been a long that you've been working on this, so we understand that you're an expert in this area. So for our listeners, what exactly is therapeutic fasting and where is it showing the strongest evidence today?
So fasting is literally the complete abstinence of all substances except water in an environment of complete rest. And we do this in a medically supervised setting. In other words, not everybody's a candidate for a long-term water-only fast. We fast people ranging from a few days to up to 40 days on water only. And so you, first of all, have to make sure a person's a good candidate for that intervention. You do that with a medical history, a physical exam, and laboratory testing. Once you know a person's a good candidate for fasting, you still have to make sure that you're monitoring them during the fast so that the problems with dehydration or electrolyte imbalance don't become a limiting factor. And then most importantly, after fasting, it's important that very careful, structured refeeding take place to avoid the problems that you have with post-fasting edema or refeeding syndrome or other very serious consequences. So when it's done right, it's safe and effective. If it's not done right, it can be very serious problems. Yeah. And we've actually published fasting safety data in the peer-reviewed literature showing that, in fact, fasting can be done safely utilizing this protocol.
Okay. And nowadays, intermittent fasting is also very trending. So how is that different and what do you want to say about that?
Yeah, so intermittent fasting is basically trying to do a fasting mimicking approach where you get some of the benefits of fasting, but without having to have the more involved long-term medically supervised fasting. Now, we've been using things like time-restricted feeding for 50 years, and that's essentially limiting how late in the evening you eat. We suggest not eating 3 to 4 hours before you go to sleep. And just by doing that, you get a 12-hour fast every day. And for people trying to lose weight, we sometimes have them extend that period of fasting another 4 hours in the morning and do some exercise so they preferentially burn fat. And so that would give them a 16-hour fast every single day. The advantage to that type of fasting is it doesn't require medical evaluation. You don't have to change your medication profile. It's something people can do on their own safely. Longer-term fasting, this up to 40 days on water only, needs to have medical supervision and support in order to ensure that it's safe and effective. So there's a big difference in that intermittent fasting is much more accessible, much simpler. It doesn't have the same impact, obviously, that long-term fasting does, but cumulatively, it can be very beneficial.
So you mentioned 2 days to up to 40 days, right? 40 days, that long also person can
That's
go.
as long as we go. There is a history of some patients fasting people longer than that, but you have to be very careful. In fact, I learned about fasting when I did my osteopathic training in Australia from a man named Alec Burton. And I remember asking Dr. Burton, by the time I got there, he'd already been practicing for many, many years. And he was no longer fasting people longer than 40 days. He used to fast people 60 days up to 100 days. And I asked him why we weren't doing any more of that long-term fasting. And he said it was because of sleep deprivation. And I asked him if the patients had more trouble sleeping after 40 days. And he said, not the patients, me. Because it turns out when you get into a really long fast over 40 days, you have to be very careful. The electrolyte balance, other things become much more critical. If you keep the fast, what we call shorter, which is less than 40 days, you run into very few complications. And in fact, we've done this for over 40 years. 25,000 people go through this fasting protocol, and we've published the fasting safety protocol in the scientific literature, demonstrating, what adverse events are, what concerns are. In fact, we've written a book called Can Fasting Save Your Life, which details all of the results of the 20 papers we published and provides not just the lay reader information on fasting, but it provides a physician everything they need to know to help guide a patient through fasting without mucking it up.
That's very interesting and a very different aspect of science. So in a clinical setting, what kind of systems or data tracking do you rely on to monitor patient safety, especially during the extended fasting?
So there's two types of data collection we do. We're a 501c3 nonprofit research organization, and as a consequence, our motivation is to collect detailed scientific information on fasting and try to guide future care. But there's also some basic clinical information that has to be collected just in order to ensure a safe and effective fasting experience. So for the clinical information, we have a standard medical history, physical exam, and laboratory data, which includes things like a chemistry panel and CBC, and we look at certain micronutrients as a baseline to establish fasting appropriateness and provide a baseline to compare back to. Then the patients are examined twice a day, every day, by physicians on our staff. They're staying in an inpatient setting in a controlled environment. So they're seen twice a day to collect vitals and to evaluate how their clinical presentation is going along, provide education and inspiration for the patients. In addition to twice daily examinations, we have an exhaustive educational program. We call it education. It's really kind of brainwashing because they're getting a lot of information on what they're going to need to do when they go home so they can maintain the results and help us have good long-term outcome data. And then as they come off the fast, they're in a controlled refeeding program. So for every week of fasting, for example, there's a day of fresh fruit and vegetable juices, a day of raw fruit and vegetables, and then progressively getting people into more concentrated calories, including steamed and starchy vegetables, whole grains, beans, nuts, and seeds. What we don't use are animal products, so meat, fish, fowl, eggs, and dairy products, and we don't use refined carbohydrates, oil, or added salt or sugar. And by doing that, we get people on an exclusively whole plant food diet that we describe as SOS free, or salt, oil, and sugar free. When we think about salt, oil, and sugar, we realize they're not food. They're actually chemicals added to food to stimulate dopamine production in our brain, which is the neurochemical associated with pleasure. So we add these chemicals to the food, and it results in people systematically overeating. That's why 70% of the population now in industrialized countries are actually technically obese, and not just overweight anymore. If you look at the new definitions of obesity, which is a BMI of over 30 or a BMI over 27, along with problems like high blood pressure, diabetes, almost 70% of the population now qualify as clinically obese. And it's because we fooled our brain satiety mechanisms with chemicals added to our food, and those chemicals being salt, oil, and sugar. It works in humans, it works in all other animals. You give them access, for example, rodents. You give them ad libitum feed of their normal rodent chow, they get to a certain size. You add salt, oil, and sugar, they'll gain 40% of their body weight in 60 days. These are biological stimulants that are basically, it's just a question of how fat do you want to be. On the other hand, if you take the salt, oil, and sugar out of the diet and you go back to a whole plant food diet, people lose weight in a predictable way. If they're a female, they lose about 2 pounds a week, a male about 3 pounds a week, down to optimum weight. If they fast, they lose 1 pound a day. And what's interesting about weight loss and fasting is you preferentially burn visceral fat. So for example, in a study we did using DEXA technology along with human beings fasting, we were able to show that a typical person fasting for 2 weeks would lose 10% of their body weight, but they would lose 20% of their total fat and more than 40% of their visceral fat. So they were losing preferential mobilization of this visceral fat. Interesting enough, that's also what happens with tumors. if you have a breast tumor, for example, and you go on a fast and lose 10% of your body weight, you don't necessarily just lose 10% of the tumor. You may lose 50% of the tumor or 100% of the tumor because the body's preferentially mobilizing tissues in inverse proportion to its vitality and need. So we have this interesting opportunity to take this ancient biological adaptation called fasting and apply it in a modern situation where people have dietary excess, which really never happened before. This is really novel. It's literally just in recent times have humans ever been exposed to consistent dietary excess. In fact, these diseases we're talking about used to be called the diseases of kings because it was only the wealthy elite kings that could develop them. And now everybody's developing them because 70% of the population are clinically obese.
So, like when the patient go back home, do you recommend them having less like sugar, salt, and then other things?
They adopt the diet we teach them about at the True North Health Center, which is an exclusively whole plant food diet that's vegan and free of added salt, oil, and sugar. And so this is the diet that actually is consistent with long-term health and longevity. Not just living longer, that is fulfilling your life expectancy, but more importantly, extending lifespan. And lifespan, people are spending an average of 16 years debilitated because they've had their strokes and heart attacks and arthritis and cancer. You can delay or defer those chronic degenerative diseases with a health-promoting diet and lifestyle. You still have to get your exercise and sleep, but diet, sleep, and exercise can help people live to where the last 20 years of their life are the best 20 years instead of the worst 20 years, so that they can live until they go to sleep one night and don't wake up with a good death, rather than spend the last decades unable to talk or move, lying in some nursing home bed waiting for people to change their diaper because they've had a stroke.
Could you see AI tools like automated vital tracking or predictive alert systems supporting clinical supervision without replacing human judgment?
So one of the things, the second part of the diagnostics that we do are the research-based diagnostics, and that's been revolutionary. In fact, we have a customized EMR that's based on Salesforce that allows us to do data mining that would be overwhelming were it not for automation. The ability to do this type of research is really dependent on the use of appropriate statistical technology. I mean, we did studies decades ago manually, and it would take thousands of hours. And now it's relatively easy because of not just an efficient electronic medical record system, but also the use of AI, which can automate a lot of processes that we couldn't have even dreamed of being able to efficiently process in the past.
Because operationally, there are a lot of moving parts like intake, nutrition, supervision, follow-up. Have you experimented with automating any of the processes?
I'll give you an example. We have a smart portal where people go on before they come in and they answer questions that are dependent on their answers. So if yes, they've had diabetes, and it's going to ask them about A1C, and it's going to ask a lot of questions that used to be extracted by physicians during examination. So we believe we save at least 20 minutes every single time we do an intake examination as a consequence of having a smart patient portal. And that information comes in ahead of time. So by the time the doctor sees the patient, we've already collected all the information that we need. We've ordered history. We've built a chart. It's relatively easy to record the data. The technology also helps us avoid errors, not just in patient tracking, but also you can enter in various laboratory data and symptomatic history and get differential diagnosis generated. So it aids the physician in avoiding misdiagnosis or errors. So I think that the future is going to be strongly dependent on sophisticated and continued development of these technologies. Early on, and we were very frustrating because they took a lot of clicks, and they were good for the billing companies. They weren't good for physicians. But I believe that that's actually getting much better now. Also, even simple things like patient questions can be very efficiently handled by artificial intelligence much more effectively than humans, not to mention they can work 24/7. We can have 15% of our patients come from foreign countries, 50% come from out of state. And so being able to work on people's timelines is really important. We've also found we have a number of employees around the world, and that's been really helpful. You can get specialized employees that live in places far away, but they're able to work effectively and efficiently remotely. And, that's been hugely helpful, particularly for a business like ours that deals with people from all over the world.
How many employees you have?
We have 72 employees. 56 of them are on site, and the rest are remote employees. The number of remote employees increasing. We also have doctors that not all of our doctors live here. Many of our research physicians live remotely, and they're able to effectively work without having to be moving here. So we can recruit from the entire world. And then even in the people that we do recruit to work here, we provide housing for our employees, for many of our employees. And so they're able to, we live in an expensive area in California, but because we can provide housing, basically anybody can afford to live here as long as they don't have any overhead. So that's allowed us to also recruit people. And that's important for us because we're a very much service-oriented business, and we need physicians and employees with a service-oriented attitude, but that have the skill sets that we need. And you can't always find those within a 5-mile radius of your physical plant.
So you mentioned about the smart portal which you use for the intake form. Like apart from the intake form, are you using the automation or any kind of AI tools anywhere in your operational workflow?
Well, also in tracking all of our data, now you can enter in, for example, laboratory findings, correlate it with diagnosis. You can run, how many people have we had with this problem? What are the outcomes been? Well, that would have been very labor intensive in the past, if possible at all. And now it's relatively simple, at least for our very tech-oriented AI doctors, have that stuff vomited up in a moment. So it's made it much more effective and efficient in terms of asking questions, designing research. I think that's just been critical. I think that's one of the reasons why research has been so expensive and so rarefied, is because you really had to depend on really large organizations and huge budgets to do meaningful work. Whereas you can see we're turning out papers published in major impact journals, in a small facility with a relatively low budget. So I think a lot of that's because of the benefits of technology and utilizing it effectively.
You see the potential for data analytics to help quantify the fasting outcome more effectively over time.
No question. And, this is an area where there's not that much research been done previously. So everything we're doing is really virgin data. And so it's very, very helpful for us to be able to efficiently process that, particularly given our modest staff.
And lifestyle medicine requires daily discipline. How do you keep patients engaged once they leave the clinic?
Well, I think a lot of that is patient selection. If you select highly motivated patients, they tend to be more compliant. And I find that the thing that motivates people is twofold. One, pain, debility, and fear of death is really good. And so they're, being forced by pain and debility and not wanting to die. We get a lot of those patients that are pretty compliant. The other is intelligent people that are proactive. They're trying to do preventative care. And we get our share of those people. It turns out we did a study looking at the effect of fasting in healthy people compared to sick people. And as helpful as fasting is in helping, say, reduce cardiometabolic risk factors in sick people, proportionally, it's actually more helpful in healthy people. The people that get the most benefit of fasting turn out to be the healthy people wanting to stay healthy, rather than waiting until they're sick and then trying to undo it, which we've done a lot of over the last 40 years. If you take healthy people and use periodic fasting, you can keep them healthy with relatively brief periods of fasting and good dietary discipline, and then they never get sick to begin with. And we are going to be doing a study now that's looking at long-term follow-up. We're going to be enrolling several thousand people for the rest of their life, and looking at, can we avoid that last 20 years of debility where most of the expenses and most of the suffering takes place. And we believe that we can prevent that by adopting diet, sleep, exercise, and preventative fasting.
If AI and automation could help patients stay compliant, say through a digital coach that tracks behavior, nutrition, and vitals, what features would make it genuinely useful rather than intrusive?
Right. Well, what you need are, they're trying to develop, in fact, we have companies working with us on wearables that provide objective feedback on a right then basis, an instant basis. For example, if while a person's eating health compromising foods, they could get immediate feedback instead of having to wait until the scale starts going up or their blood pressure goes up at 2 hours, 10 hours, 2 days, a month later. I think people would have a better adherence to dietary impact. The problem is there's a delay. They eat the food, it artificially stimulates dopamine in their brain. They feel good. Their brain is telling them it's great. And then later, when they get on the scale or they measure their objectives, they realize that they've compromised their health. If they could get objective feedback immediately while they're taking the substance in, I think we could improve adherence. I want to tell you something, though. We did a study with our colleague from the Mayo Clinic on the treatment of high blood pressure, which is the leading contributing cause of death and disability. And we took 27 subjects with stage 2 hypertension that were medicated, and 26 of those people had an entirely normal blood pressure by the end of their fasting experience. And at 1 year, 76% of those people had maintained their weight loss, and the majority still had normal blood pressure without medication. That's a year later. So we've shown that you can, with the appropriate patients, get people to make radical diet and lifestyle changes and maintain those changes. The problem is not everybody's interested in doing that. And so I believe that part of the strategy is to select those people that have the characteristics, both physically as well as psychologically, that are inclined to be successful long-term. And we've shown that that can be done.
Many clinics now use like AI-generated content for patient education, video explainers, system quizzes, and chatbots. Do you think such tools could make evidence-based fasting knowledge more accessible at scale?
I do. I think that if it's designed properly, it can be effective. As you know, though, one of the limitations of AI now, like if you're using AI to write up a report or an article or a study, you really have to have an expert review that because there's a lot of errors and things that come through. It's not as sophisticated as it might be in the future. So I'll give you an example. Our director of research has found that she can cut the time it takes to write some of these scientific reports by 80% through the use of AI, but it doesn't completely eliminate her need to go in and do critical work, both in terms of deciding what questions to ask and also trying to interpret the material that's being vomited up by AI. So I think it's hugely helpful, particularly at eliminating some of the lower level, kind of what we call grind work, but not necessarily in the design and the interpretation realm. Again, I think it's going to really help people at the higher level of functioning be dramatically more effective and efficient. I don't know that you're going to be replacing those people.
Yes, I think if you combine both the things together, cut down on the routine tasks, but then you still need to have a human review at the most critical functions.
It seems like, though, a lot of what it's getting rid of is the stuff that people don't really like to do, the kind of mundane, repetitive, boring, and the stuff that people tend to resonate more with is preserved. And so I see it as highly positive with the understanding that you still have to be, it's just like I have a car that's an autonomous driving automobile, okay? And it's brilliant. And for me, being directionally dyslexic, it's just a godsend. But it's still, there are critical times where it will make errors, usually because the circumstances in the road are altered or whatever. And so you better be paying attention or you're going to have serious problems. On the other hand, if you look at the number of accidents in a autonomous vehicle compared to a human-driven vehicle, there's significantly lower incidents. The autonomous vehicles, at least what I'm driving, still requires some higher level support.
Looking ahead, where do you see the biggest opportunity for responsible technology use in lifestyle medicine, especially personalization and long-term adherence?
Well, because the limiting factor for us is patient adherence, I'm always excited about the opportunity to motivate, educate, inspire, or intimidate people into doing what they know they should do but are reluctant to doing. And so I think that's one area where technology is going to be just very, very helpful. I think the immediate feedback issues, especially these wearable technologies that give people positive feedback, non-invasive diagnostic testing, I think is going to be hugely helpful. And then helping physicians interpret the massive data that's being generated, I think is going to be critical because you can't work as effectively and efficiently with large volumes of data as the technology can. And then also, non-invasive diagnostic, let's be really clear. So we used to cut people open in order to get certain information. And now you can do all kinds of reliable non-invasive diagnostic testing that's safe and effective and saves just inordinate amounts of potential risk. Goodness knows that technology is changing every day.
Misunderstood aspect of fasting? What do you think?
People think that if you get on a plane in New York and were to fly to California, you would die over Colorado from starvation unless you ate the pretzels. They think the pretzels saved their life, So the idea is they don't understand that fasting is a biological adaptation. All the humans that couldn't fast died. And it's because the brain of the human is ridiculously large. It's 2.5 times that of volume as a chimp. And it's our biggest burner of glucose. And so if you couldn't fast, if you couldn't change your brain fuel from burning sugar to burning fat, you could only go about a week. And what happened is all the humans that wandered away from the tropics died because spring comes late sometimes and there's nothing to eat. And so because we have this huge brain, we had to have a capacity to adapt. And now with fasting, you can go up to 70 days. Not you should, but you could fast a very long time because the body can very efficiently convert to burning fat reserves. And so people just don't understand that fasting is a biological adaptation so critical to survival that every human being has this adaptation. Of the 8 billion people on the planet, everybody, you take away food and that's what happens. And all we've done is taken this ancient biological adaptation and applied it in a situation that never existed before. And that's where the population had unlimited access to dietary excess. And now we're dying from diseases that never used to be killing people. And now they're routinely killing people. And the good news is you can reverse the consequence of dietary excess with fasting.
Patient misconception that automation could help correct.
Automation is not going to correct the fact that you still have to live healthy to be healthy. You still have to control what you put in your mouth. You still have to control your activities, your sleep, your exercise. And if you don't do that, no pills, potions, powders, treatment, or technology is going to undo the consequences of not living healthy. You're a biological organism. You have to live within your capacities. We're trying to pretend that you don't. It doesn't work.
A metric that tell you how the program is working in terms of fasting.
The metrics that we use are broad. I mean, because you're looking at basically all the non-invasive diagnostic parameters that you can measure. So we've got blood and urine testing, physical examination, and clinical, presentation. Collecting that information, processing and interpreting is where technology comes in, but you still have to actually, pay attention to the patient in front of you. You can't rely strictly on the data points because they don't tell the full picture, but they're incredibly helpful at guiding our decision making. For example, when we're monitoring a patient's physical presentation during fasting, we have certain parameters that we use, like potassium levels. And we use potassium and sodium as rate-limiting nutrients. You can't measure every single thing in the body, but there are certain things you can measure that are rate-limiting. So as long as sodium and potassium are okay, we know the other things you can't measure that are less sensitive downstream are likely okay. And so we've developed these parameters in monitoring 25,000 patients. And the way we did is we went back and looked at all the complications that come up and figured out how could we have predicted that? And what were the parameters that indicate that? And now we have an algorithm that we can use in order to be able to predict who's going to be safe and effective. Like, for example, with diabetes, we know if we start with a hemoglobin A1C of 10 or less, that we have very little complications compared to if we allow people to do fasting with hemoglobins over that. So we'll treat them until they meet those defined parameters, and then our risk profile goes down. So, and that's a process in progress. And the technology is giving us more and more data, more and more feedback. We can kind of fine tune that algorithm. But ultimately, you still have to pay attention to the patient in order to get a good.
One innovation you're personally excited about in health sector?
Well, I'm excited about some of these wearables that these companies we're working with are developing, because we're going to be able to get not just take blood tests every hour, but constant impact that have the capacity to give us insulin levels, glucose levels continuously. And so again, with technology, we'll be able to have the ability to make decisions and interpretation as we're going along, not just periodically, not having to poke people every hour or whatever. Even some of these tools we have now, like a continuous blood pressure monitoring, where we get 100 data points instead of a few data points, allows us to more accurately understand what's going on. I'm a big fan of all this, as long as it's non-invasive and non-disruptive. One of the problems with a lot of diagnostic testing is it's been traditionally invasive. You have to do a fat biopsy of somebody in order to get an analysis of what's going on in their system. Now we're going to be able to get it electronically without them even being aware of the process going on.
Dr. Goldhammer, thank you for such a thoughtful conversation. It's fascinating to see how evidence-based fasting and intelligent automation can coexist, one rooted in biology and other one in data, both helping people take control of their health.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Thanks everyone for tuning in, and remember, healthcare innovation starts with curiosity.